All the good we have, some of the bad, is dependent on that belief. And we cannot have a nation that does not have that. Otherwise, it's a cut flower civilization, and eventually cut off from those presuppositions, it'll fade and die. If we look at the French Revolution, which was largely capturing Catholic property, and I may have mentioned this last time, they used value of the churches and the church's land as collateral for their currency. And they worked for an atheistic view. It turned out really, really badly for everybody, including the people who started it. If you look at Robespierre, who was one of the lead instigators of the French Revolution, how did it end for Robespierre? The guillotine. Those atheistic revolutions tend to end badly, including for those who are part of that revolution.
Let's begin by unpacking exactly what it looks like, what a society looks like when it's built almost like the United States on a religious foundation versus one that is built on something without religion in mind.
Yeah, so there's considerable public debate as to whether or not the United States was founded on a religious heritage. I think if you look at the 13 original colonies, each had its own state religion. John Adams said about our government that this government was wholly inappropriate, would only work with a religious population. And the reason he said that is that it requires the population to be self-regulating rather than the government required to regulate the people. And what religion has historically done is it has trained its adherents, not in every case, but in many cases, for self-regulation, for self-control. And without that internal locus of control, without that internal self-regulation, you're going to need a different kind of government to regulate the behavior of people. So the United States and some other countries who have an inherent belief that there is a supernatural being to whom we are responsible, and that changes the individual's motive for self-regulation. It becomes internally focused, not to please the government, but to please another authority, in this case, a supernatural authority, God. That allows a low intrusive government to exist because it assumes people will self-regulate. As soon as people have no self-regulation or require an external source besides God to self-regulate, then the wheels come off the wagon. So the United States and some other countries who are founded on that have that benefit. If people do not have a God concept, the concept of supernatural, then they're not going to behave in the same way. That's not to say that atheists, agnostics are a different category. That's not to say that atheists don't behave in ethical or even moral ways. But I can't remember which British atheist it is. It might have been Richard Dawkins. He said, I like living in a Christian culture. And what he's saying is, I don't like the beliefs, but I certainly like the consequences of the beliefs. And what he's appreciating is the benefit of a cosmology or a theology, an idea of how the universe works that gives him all these benefits. He just doesn't want to believe those things. And I didn't invent this phrase, but I love it so much, I'm borrowing it, which is, it's a cut flower civilization. And a cut flower civilization says that you're going to have this beautiful flower cut off from the roots, the source of supply. It will be pretty for a little while until it withers. And if we eliminate the source of that self-control and that self-regulation, then we have a cut flower civilization. The beauty that was created by that worldview will then fall apart. A society makes people in a society make truth claims. They make claims about what is true. And in my work, I ask my clients what I call the 8 most important questions. And I'll talk about the first 2, the other 6 maybe another day. But the first question is, what are you going to say about God? And when I'm in a business that's publicly traded, HR departments freak out when I say that. And it's not that I'm interested in people agreeing with me, but what you're going to say about God, the existence of a supernatural, has downstream effects on all of the other questions. The second question is, what are you going to say about truth? Does truth exist? And I'll show you why the first question is the first question. So if you make truth claims like 2 + 2 = 4, who says? Which, if you know literature, was the central question in the book 1984 that Winston Smith had to struggle with. And when he was in room 101, he decided, well, maybe it doesn't have to. If enough people believe it, it doesn't have to be 4. It could be 5, or it could be anything else that the state says. So truth claims, many people who are atheists go back to math. They go, math is math. Physics is physics. And you can't get around that. Those are the truth claims. And that's fine. Some atheists will land there. What they argue, though, is that truth claims about fact are different than truth claims about morality. So what they'll say is 2 + 2 always equals 4, but we'll go by cultural or morality votes about whether eating children is okay. And if everybody in a certain country or a certain region thinks eating children is okay, I use this example because it's pretty dramatic, then it must be okay. And so if you're in, whatever land, and they eat children and you're there as a guest, hey, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. I'm not saying the Romans eat kids. But whenever you're in this mythical country that eats children, then you're going to think it's okay to eat children, which is, in my morality, horrific.
It's like Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal. If you ever read that.
I've never read that. So
well, there you go.
There you go. Now I have to. So thank you. People ask me, where did you learn about that book? It's like, because somebody told me that it was good, so I had to read it. Now I have to read A Modest Proposal. Thank you for introducing me to that. Now I'm curious about A Modest Proposal. What is A Modest Proposal about?
It's almost exactly like that. It was a proposal, and if you know anything about Swift, he's satirical. Yeah. So it was a quote unquote proposal about how to solve the hunger crisis in Britain at the time. And that was literally his proposal, was that this is not such a bad idea to, there's an endless supply of children. So, and the public, the reading public, just blew it all out of proportion, didn't understand the concept at all. He was trying to make a point about how terrible the government was handling the crisis. Yes. And they, people do, they took it seriously and said, how dare you suggest such a terrible thing? But it's a really great example, because Britain in all its history, obviously, was a very religious nation. And so what is satire to that nation may not have been presented as satire to another nation. Fine.
They may be, 200 years from now, somebody may read it as a prescription rather than a satire. But what it gets at is, who decides what morality, what's good or what's bad? And if we say 51% say it's bad and 49% say it's good, then it's bad. Is that really a good measure? Because the winds of public opinion change. Human beings are so fickle. So what's good and what's bad changes with the time. Is there such a thing as a morality that transcends time? For that to be true, truth claims have to lean on something else. truth claims about math and physics have to lean on something else. What is that thing that they lean on? Which is, what are you going to say about God?
You mean truth isn't self-defining?
Well, if you're arrogant enough to believe as a human being that you can know the infinite, then yes, it could be self-defining. See, I took a course in comparative religions, in the history of religions, and I love this one quote, which is, it's a Hindu quote, which is, the finite mind cannot understand the infinite. And I love that. And what happens with modernity, what happens with humans is because we stand on the shoulders of giants, we think we're so smart and so arrogant that we can understand the infinite. And so we think we can create these new ways of doing things without understanding that they're based on, they're leaning on something else. And that something else, that truth claim, is leaning on a God concept. Now, if you're an atheist, you'll go, well, that's just a convenient, it's a convenient human belief that's functional. Okay, we don't have to have that argument today. But if you do believe in a supernatural, then you believe, then you start asking questions like, is it the cosmic well of souls? Is it just the universe of souls all together with a cosmic unconsciousness? Or is it a being separate and apart from the collected souls of all humanity that precede us? Is it separate and apart? And you have different ideas about that. But if the supernatural is separate and apart, then then you have questions about, is it an all-powerful supernatural being? Is it all-knowing? Is it ever-present? Is it eternal? Does it last forever? Then you get to the imponderables about, does this supernatural control everything? Or like the watchmaker, wind up the watch, sit back and watch what happens. And those are, interesting debates, all of which lean on this concept that there is a separate entity that is somehow knowable. Then you got to answer the questions, is this knowable being good or bad? And you can, you believe either way. But if it's all powerful, all knowing, and omnipresent and bad, man, you're totally screwed. But
well, and I think our world would reflect that, right?
Well, maybe our world does reflect that. I don't believe that. I believe in a knowable, good God who is omnipresent, omniscient, eternal, and all-powerful. There are people, Rabbi Kushner, when bad things happen to good people, he argued that God is basically good, but not all-powerful. That was his essential conclusion. And there are other people who I respect tremendously who believe that. I don't. But it goes back to the truth claim. The truth claim leans on the existence of a separate entity that defines the truth claim. And so it's not that I define the truth claim. I don't define what's good or bad. And atheists could say, well, Roger, you're just resting on traditions that have been around for tens of thousands of years and then are adaptive. Okay, that may be true. And yet, all of those lean on something. They lean on this belief.
Yeah.
And so as a nation, it's necessary for self-regulation to have a God concept. And, in the West, it's a monotheistic God. From the Near East, from the Middle East to the West, it's a monotheistic God. There are pockets of monotheism around the world, but largely whatever has come out from Israel through the Roman Empire and spread to the world is largely a monotheistic religion. Again, pockets elsewhere, but largely that pathway and what we would call Western civilization has all been touched with this view of this worldview. And so everything in that Western civilization is dependent on that belief. I think we
They
can
don't start very well either.
Well, they don't start well and they don't end well. I think one place we can look is in history, and at least in modern history, there's only been one nation who declared itself an atheistic nation. Do you know which one it was? The national religion was atheism from the 1940s up till the 1990s.
I don't. I would say China, but they're deeply religious.
Long Confucian tradition. Mao attempted to get rid of that, but boy, it's pretty tough to get rid of.
Because it runs so deep out there.
It runs so deep. Yeah. It's Albania. Under the dictator Enver Hoxha, Albania was the only declared atheistic country in the world. And if you don't remember what Albania was like, it was cut off from the rest of the world. They actually rejected Stalin because he was too Western, too liberal. When you reject Stalin as too liberal, and so they became trading partners pretty much with North Korea. So those were the two most repressive countries in the world. Well, how did it end up for Albania? Awful and awful. It was as an atheistic country cut off from the rest of the world, they were under the notion that the rest of the world wanted to invade Albania because it was so good. And that there were American paratroopers waiting to parachute into Albania to get their rich natural resources. 99% of the people in the United States couldn't identify Albania on a map. Just so that you know, for those of you who don't know, look at Italy. You know the heel on the boot? Go east, across the Adriatic, boom, there's Albania. I mean, it's a tiny little country. When Enver Hoxha passed away, fortunately, there was a quiet revolution, and they became more of a democratic country. Fortunately, there wasn't much in the way of bloodshed. But if you talk to people who lived in Albania during Enver Hoxha's reign, it was a totalitarian state worse than the worst of Stalin. That's the consequence of an atheistic government.
Interesting. Wow. I would love to do more of a compare and contrast on that. That is, because that's so recent in our history too.
Hoxha died in the late 1980s. His son took over for a few years, but they were pretty much done by about 1992, 1993, I think.
Wow.
You just couldn't get in there as a Westerner. You were just unable to. It was people in Albania didn't know what the rest of the world was like. They only knew what their dictator told them.
Well, it sounds like a pretty scary existence as an Albanian.
Yes. So go talk to some people who lived there in that era, and it was pretty horrible. So that's
I wonder what their legal system was.
It was a police state. They would come and they would say, you criticize the government, you're going to prison. That's how it worked. And I said, I went to visit Albania, and they said, I asked, what, did they bring guns? And they said they didn't need to bring guns. I said, did you ever think of escaping? Escape to where?
Mm-hmm.
Because the rest of the world was, in their minds, worse. So they had created this idea that the dictator, the president, was a god figure. Mm-hmm. They didn't have television. They didn't have cars. There were no stoplights in Albania because there were no cars. There were no buildings above 5 stories because there were no elevators. I mean, the list could go on. That's the consequence of an atheistic worldview, an unalloyed atheistic worldview.
Interesting how even in an atheist state, something is set up to be God.
Well, it goes back to the Blaise. I believe it's Blaise Pascal. Is that there is a place in the heart of every man to a God-shaped box in the heart of every man, that there's something that wants to fill that and worship. So there then becomes, the atheists will argue that it's an adaptive feature of the human psyche, and the religious will say, no, that's just how we're created. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm gonna have to do some more history research on Albania. That is really cool. So let's shift a little bit and look at the role religion plays, even just on a personal level, because we here in the United States see a little bit more of a war on just religion in general these days. It's taken out of our classrooms. It's not taught as a universal anymore. And more people are either just not going to church ever in their lives, or are just stopping going to church and don't really practice what in theory they were raised to believe.
Yeah.
But I would still argue that even being raised on religious principles plays a huge role in personal development. And I wonder what you see as the benefits of being at least raised with religious principles, or raised without any kind of religion in your life at all.
Well, I guess the first preface I would give is there are lots of ways that people practice religion badly. I'm not defending any of those. So we'll just get that out of the way. So if you want to argue with me about bad religion, I'm with you. There's lots and lots of bad religion. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who sincerely and earnestly practice their faith and live it out. Second preface is, nor am I talking about the imperfection of human beings to fully live out their faith. The constant criticism of the religious is that they're hypocrites. Yeah.
Aren't we all?
In my life, I have decided who in my life was the least hypocritical person in the world. And that person was Larry Flynt. Do you know who Larry Flynt was?
No, I don't.
Larry Flynt was a resident of my hometown and home state, who was the publisher of Hustler magazine. And he said, it's just sex. And Larry lived a pretty reprobate life, completely consistent with his values. Larry was not a hypocrite at all, because his moral hurdle was so low, anybody could cross it. It's all just sex. It's all okay. Whatever you want to do is okay. You couldn't call Larry a hypocrite because he had no standard against which to measure his behavior. I have higher standards than that, and I fail all the time. So of course I'm a hypocrite, which is I have standards of behavior that I think are right, and I'm either unable or unwilling all the time to achieve them. Yes, that's the measure of the hypocrite. If you think if you're self-righteous, that adds a little bonus hypocrisy to it. But all of us who have high standards for our behavior and fail either through will or through weakness to meet those are, of course, hypocrites. So people with strong religious worldviews are clearly and always going to be hypocritical because they're unable to meet those high standards.
Makes sense. Absolutely.
So now
I'm
you're going to
wondering,
research
though.
Albania and Larry Flynt.
I know.
Albania.
Very interesting. It'll be a long day of research for me, which will be a lot of fun.
More time on Albania.
Maybe after the election. That's really interesting. I wonder if there is obviously just even being raised with religion in mind gives people the opportunity to think a little bit more about their lives, about why they do things, why they believe certain things, what exactly they believe, versus somebody who was not even raised with that question in mind at all, about whether God exists, about why we should live according to the laws of our nation and why those laws exist. And so in one's personal development, do you see a difference in morality and a difference in how they interact with coworkers, with government, with all these different things in their life between one person and another?
I hate to paint in such a broad brush. I would
It's a
say
broad question.
it's a broad question. I would say one of the people in my life who I admire for his ethical stance and who was a man of his word is also an atheist. And I have tremendous respect for him. And it's probably coupled with, I don't know how he does it on his own. So there are, of course, people who don't agree with my religious worldview that have an extra dose of self-discipline or personal self-control. But for the average run-of-the-mill person, religion does have a benefit. Of course, there are people who are Herculean in their moral code who don't have a religious or a God worldview, and I know one. Actually, I know several, but one comes to mind easiest. So on average, what I would say is that what religion does is it helps those who need a little help get over that hurdle. I think what the belief in a transcendent supernatural figure, God, does for people, if they're really introspective enough, it provides them a level of humility to know how small and insignificant they are. It's hard to be arrogant when you take in how massive the universe is, and even in small things. If you stand on the shore of the ocean and realize, oh my gosh, I'm nothing, or if you're next to a large animal like an elephant, it reminds you, oh, I really am tiny. It doesn't really matter what I think about myself. So all of these interactions with things that are larger than us will cause us to have humility, which is a good quality, which helps us to treat others, I think, with greater dignity and with greater love because of that.
Are you saying that those of us who are religious are the ones who need the most help or who would otherwise need the most help?
Again, I don't want to paint with a broad brush.
I know, I'm kidding.
But I grew up in the church, and there are plenty of them there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Thank God for forgiveness.
Yes.
So here's where I think we'll end it. But this is a fairly controversial question nowadays. Do you think religion belongs in education, especially early education?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it does. And then you have the debate of whose responsibility is it to educate the children? Is it the responsibility of the state, who may or may not have the same religious worldview of you, or is early education the purview of the family? If we look back at the founding of our country, there was no such thing as a public education. Public education didn't exist. That was a transformation because the state had a legitimate interest in an educated populace. The state does have an interest in an educated populace, but perhaps they're not the best people to be running that program. So I think the family is the primary group that has an interest in the education of their young and their children, and that benefits everyone else. So yeah, I think if you're a person of religion, then a religious education makes sense. Pick the kind that you want. If you're Jewish, there's the yeshiva. If you're Christian, there are parochial schools, there are religious schools. So there's the opportunity for this kind of education everywhere. And even if it isn't 5 days a week, there are other days of the week that religious education can happen.
Is it in the state's best interest to make sure that there's some kind of basic education about religion at all. For morality's sake, for law-abiding citizenry's sake.
I think so. I think so. That then comes the thorny question of then whose religion is it?
Mm-hmm.
And I
and it requires the state to admit that there's a God.
Well, it requires the state to admit that there's a benefit to religious education, not that there is a God. I mean, I could find a benefit. I think atheists could believe, yes, there is a benefit to our society of people believing this. So it's an efficiency or an effectiveness argument that it may not be true, but it works. And those of us who do have a faith would argue it is true and it works.